Jaguar was formed in 1922 by William Lyons and William Walmsley as the Swallow Sidecar Company, or SS for short. Then the custom coach builders expanded into two-seat car bodies for Morris and Austin in 1927, and within a few years they were offering custom bodies on Standards, Wolseleys, and Fiats, and were also experimenting with an in-house sports car. Their first production model was the SS1, produced from 1932 to 1936. Chassis and drivetrains were provided by Standard, with the car being roughly 185 inches long. Initially offered in 2 and 2.5 liter versions, providing 48 or 62 horsepower from the 6-cylinder engines. Priced just over 300 pounds, they looked much more expensive than they actually were. Soon it was joined by a smaller 4-cylinder version called the SS2, and engines would be enlarged across the board for 1934, with their first actual sports car being the SS90 of 1935. Essentially just a shortened, open-top version of the SS1, it was named for its claimed top speed of 90 miles an hour. But the car quickly earned a reputation as having more show than go, and only 148 were made. And a more powerful SS Jaguar was introduced to fix the issue of go by moving the 2.5 liter engine to overhead valve, bumping horsepower by 12 to 102. Still looking twice as expensive as its 400-pound price, and it would soon be joined by a cheaper 1.5 liter version, then a more expensive 3.5 liter version called the SS Jaguar 100, once again indicating its top speed. By this time, the saloons would be named for engine sizes as the 1.5, 2.5, and 3.5 liter, respectively. The sidecar and coach building side of the business would be sold off, and in 1938 the company began moving from handcrafted wooden frames to steel construction. But coming out of World War II, the SS designation had gained a certain negative stigma. So in 1945, the board of directors voted to rename the company Jaguar Cars Limited. The sports car returned in 1948 with the XK120, continuing the tradition of putting the top speed in the name. It was 173 inches long on a 102-inch wheelbase, and weighed under 2,900 pounds, powered by a 3.4 liter dual overhead cam inline 6 with up to 160 horsepower. A super sport version could get to 60 in under 9 seconds and do a 17-second quarter mile, making it one of the top performing cars of the era. At the same time, their line of saloons were upgraded as the Mark V, upgrades that included hydraulic brakes, independent front suspension, and balloon tires. Using a 120-inch wheelbase, it was 187 inches long and weighed 3,900 pounds. Prices were now close to 1,300 pounds. Still offered with either a 2.5 liter or 3.5 liter overhead valve 6 with 102 or 125 horsepower. It would get updated styling and the engine from the XK for 1950 to become the Mark VII, continuing to move up market, gaining 10 inches in length and costing close to 1,700 pounds. For 1951, the XK was adapted for racing as the XK120C, or competition, more commonly referred to as the C-type, the first in a series of race-ready sports cars, soon to be followed by the D-type. The continued move-up market meant room was made for a smaller executive sedan, which appeared in 1955 as the Mark I, initially taking on the 2.5 liter and later the 3.5 liter designation. It was only 181 inches long on a 108-inch wheelbase, weighing 2,800 pounds. It could still top 100 miles an hour and get to 60 in 12 seconds, but even prices of this cheaper car were now well above 1,800 pounds. The XK120 would evolve through the XK140 and XK150, just as the big sedan became the Mark 8, 9, and 10, and the smaller Mark I, the Mark II. Jaguar would take control of Daimler in 1960, with their models becoming increasingly similar going forward. By 1961, it was time for a new sports car, the E-Type, or XKE in the US. It was 175 inches long on a 96-inch wheelbase, weighing roughly 2,900 pounds. Initially with a 3.8 liter 6 with 265 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque. That could top 130 miles an hour, get to 60 in under 6 seconds, and do a mid-14-second quarter mile, and increasing to a torquier 4.2-liter for 1965, and a longer 2+2 version was added for 1966. But Jaguar's future was looking uncertain in the early 60s. So in 1965, they merged with British Motors, and then a couple years later with Leyland to form British Leyland. There was some attempt at diversification with new models, such as the S-Type and the 420, and the Mark X became the 420G. But after the second merger, the lineup was reduced to the new XJ series saloons and an updated E-Type, while Daimler had become little more than the top trim levels and the limousine of the XJ, all of which would be offered with a new V12, starting with the E-Type in 1971, a 5.3-liter, 326 cubic inch unit with 272 horsepower and 304 pound-feet of torque, increasing top speed by nearly 20 miles per hour. The XJ would go into its second generation in 1974 and would include a limited run of two-door versions as the XJC. Then in 1975, the XKE would be replaced by the XJS, or Sport, even though it wasn't a sports car, but a luxury touring coupe. Although the V12 carried over, and it did quite well in GT racing events. By this time, British Leyland was struggling, and updates were limited. The XJ Saloon got a minor facelift for 1979, and for 1981, the V12 would get high-efficiency heads for better mileage. Then in 1982, a convertible version of the XJS became available, and the next year, you could get the 6-cylinder in it. But Margaret Thatcher's restructuring plan floated off Jaguar as an independent in 1984, being one of the few British manufacturers that managed to retain its identity through this period. This new independence allowed them to address the quality and supply issues they had suffered under British Leyland, helped along by no longer having to compete with development funds and significant price hikes. Then 1986 would see the start of serious racing development of the V12 engine, while there was a new line of straight sixes and production models, as well as a new XJ series, although the old model would continue to be sold for another 5 years. All of which led to them being taken over by Ford at the end of 1989, and updates on the XJS were noticeable as soon as 1991, with the V12 increasing to 6 liters a year later. But the big news that came in 1992 was the limited production XJ220, and as you may have guessed, the number represented the car's predicted top speed. Not small, it was 194 inches long on a 104-inch wheelbase, and weighed more than 3,400 pounds. The 3.5-liter twin-turbo V6 produced 542 horsepower and 475 pound-feet of torque, and although Jaguar purists were disappointed in its V6 engine, it did set a world record for fastest production vehicle at the time, with fewer than 300 being made over 3 years. Under Ford, Jaguar's production facilities and design were thoroughly updated, made obvious by the new XJ of 1995, in spite of attempts to try to make it look more traditional, a concept that continued when the XK8 replaced the XJS a year later, a grand tourer that tried to evoke the look of the classic E-Type, 187 inches long on a 102-inch wheelbase and 3,600 pounds. It was initially powered by a 4-liter V8 with 280 horsepower and 277 pound-feet of torque, joined by a supercharged XKR version the next year, raising output to 358 horsepower and 372 pound-feet of torque, knocking a full second off its quarter-mile time, putting it in the mid-13s, and raising top speed to over 170. A smaller S-Type returned to the lineup for 1999. It was initially 189 inches long on a 115-inch wheelbase and roughly 4,000 pounds, powered by the 4-liter V8, and sharing its platform with the Lincoln LS and Ford Thunderbird. Then an even smaller X-Type arrived for 2002. On a 107-inch wheelbase, it was roughly 185 inches long and weighed 3,200 to 3,400 pounds, powered by a variety of V6 petrol engines or a turbo diesel inline 4. It was essentially a dressed-up Ford Mondeo, or Contour. While the XJ was also redesigned, with a base 3-liter V6, V8 in 3.5 and 4.2 liters, with an optional supercharger providing up to 390 horsepower, although the look remained traditional. A new XK was introduced in 2006 that tried to create a blend of classic and modern styling, 2 inches longer on a 6-inch longer wheelbase, but lighter at 3,500 pounds, and using the 4.2-liter V8 in 296 or 410 horsepower supercharged version, for a top speed near 180 miles an hour and a 13-second quarter mile. The S-Type would be replaced by the XF in 2008, and it too would make an attempt to modernize the look, almost 6 inches longer than its predecessor. Under Ford, Jaguar had seen its most successful years ever, but Ford management was no longer seeing Jaguar as an asset, and in 2008, Jaguar and Land Rover sold off to Tata of India to become Jaguar Land Rover, integrating the two brands over the next few years. But the X-Type was discontinued without an immediate replacement. The XJ would be updated in 2010 using the same design language as the XF, as its development had began long before the sale of the company. For 2014, the XK would be shortened into a true two-seater and dubbed the F-Type as the spiritual successor to the E-Type, 176 inches long on a 102-inch wheelbase and weighing 3,500 to 3,700 pounds. The supercharged 3-liter V6 was offered in 335 horsepower and 375 horsepower S versions, while the R used a supercharged 5-liter V8 for 542 horsepower, moving it through the quarter mile in under 12 seconds and to 195 miles an hour. The next year, there was a thoroughly updated XF that was joined by a smaller, cheaper version as the XE, and a year later a crossover SUV variant as the F-Pace. The smaller E-Pace arrived in 2017 as a Jaguar version of the Land Rover Discovery Sport, followed the next year by the electric I-Pace, technology that was supposed to carry over into the next generation XJ, but instead the XJ was killed off after 2019. Although like many brands, they were claiming they would be offering a fully electric lineup by 2025. In spite of its foreign ownership, Jaguar may very well be the most British car company still in existence. And as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.